This is Seventh Generation Warfare, and I am your current host, John Nelson. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at 11 lessons in the life of Robert S. McNamara. Who was Robert S. McNamara? He was Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, served through the height of the Cold War as Secretary of Defense and through Vietnam. Earlier, he served in the U.S. Air Force during World War II, where he did statistical analysis on bombing raids and helped make them more efficient. He was the first non Ford member to become CEO of the Ford Motor Company. By all accounts, he was a brilliant man. I find him quite likable, and he was also a war criminal. The lessons that we're going over tonight are from a documentary called Fog of War, which you can find on most streaming services, I believe. It's a great movie, excellently produced, great soundtrack. I particularly like Philip Glass's music. It's just very well produced. You'll find yourself drawn in. I think it's potentially hypnotic, for me, anyways. I couldn't get enough of this documentary when I was younger and more heavily propagandized into nationalism. I looked upon Robert McNamara as a very wise old man who had gleaned wisdom from his experience in very unique roles throughout his life. I have now changed my perspective quite dramatically, and I think it is ultimately quite. It's no longer an epic in my mind. It's a drama. It's a traumatic tale of how misguided a person can be. And that's, I hope if you watch it, I hope after hearing this review, I hope that you'll be able to cut through the production quality of it that sucks you in emotionally, and you'll be able to see the 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 horror that is Robert McNamara's life for what it is. So go and watch it. It's called Fog of War. Um, and it was 11 lessons in the life of Robert S. McNamara. So here we go. Lesson 1, empathize with your enemy. How convenient or ironic that this is in fact what I am doing. Not that I'm going to call him Robert. I've watched the documentary like 12 times, so I think we're on a first name basis. But not that Robert is my enemy per se or an enemy of seventh generation warfare. Our enemies tend not to be specific people. There is times in the seventh generation warfare where your enemy would be a person if the person is actually seeking to do you harm, but more times than not, our enemies are more ideas or philosophies or belief structures that infiltrate our mind and the minds of our descendants and twist our will to something other than what we actually want it to be. So what I'm opposed to is this is overall perspective on life and on war and on where we owe our duty. He is not my enemy, but I still think it ironic that his lesson number 1 is empathize with your enemy, and that is kind of, in a sense, what we are doing here tonight. He tells the story during Cuban Missile Crisis. He was in the White House during that time. Talks about how, the world is very susceptible to nuclear annihilation, as he lived firsthand through the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he said they lucked out, that the world wasn't destroyed by mostly luck in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But one of the things that did help was that one of the aides to Kennedy had known Khrushchev personally from being some sort of ambassador, and was able to come up with a solution that would work for Khrushchev, to have Khrushchev save face, and was able to put both sides in each other's shoes. he says in the Robert says in the documentary that empathizing with your enemy means, quote, we must put ourselves inside their skin and look at us through their eyes just to understand the thoughts that lie behind their decisions and their actions. So I think this lesson is overall a great lesson. Like I said, our enemies tend not to be flesh and blood, um, but we still do have enemies, and we should understand the human mindset that is propagating the ideas, and we should be able to see it from their side and our side. So that requires a certain level of exposure to the enemy's perspective, which can be damaging, but you also need it in order to build a good defense, which is why I recommend the documentary. Um, he also says in the movie that, quote, at age 85, I'm at the age I can look back and derive some conclusions about my actions. My rule has been try to learn, try to understand what happened, and develop lessons and pass them on. So I'd like to thank Robert McNamara for this learning opportunity, or the documentary, and I am thanking him for the lessons we can learn about what not to do from his life. Lesson 2, rationality alone will not save us. In this lesson, he talks about meeting with leaders of the opposition decades after the event. So in this case, he talks about meeting with Castro about Cuban Missile Crisis a couple decades after the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. And he said in the meeting with Castro, he went prepared with 3 questions. It was, did you know the missiles were in Cuba? If you knew they were there, would you have recommended to Khrushchev, who was the Russian leader, that they be used? And 3, had they been used, what would have happened to Cuba? And Castro supposedly responded saying, I did know they were there. I wouldn't have recommended. I, in fact, did recommend that they be used. And had they been used, Cuba would have been completely wiped off the map. And despite this, McNamara in the film calls Castro a rational human being. So I don't know what definition he's using of rational, but his definition of rational and my definition of rational are not the same. Despite that, I still agree with the lesson that rationality alone will not save us, and I think him in this movie is evidence of that fact, because he's a wise guy, he's a smart guy, can compute numbers, but yet he continuously found himself over the course of his life in these horrible decision making positions, and I don't hold leaders responsible for deaths in war. I think it's the individual soldier's responsibility that pulls the trigger or whatever, but he's not to blame. So he had a role in the deaths of millions of people's lives. So yes, certainly his rationality will not save us, him, or anybody. But I don't think rationality alone will save anybody also, because rationality doesn't have a moral element. So rationality without a moral compass, or without a sense of individuality, without a respect for the sanctity of life, is going to lead to horrible atrocities. I think history points this out time and time again. So how does that apply to a 7th generation warfare? Your rationality alone is not going to save your dependent or descendants. One, you need to give them the moral angle to their decision making. You have to help them develop their moral compass and their moral strength and moral fortitude. But also at the end of the day, your rationality is going to play very little into what they choose to do in their life. So you can train them to be rational, and you can hope to encourage their moral character. But at the end of the day, what they do for themselves and what they then do for descendants beyond them is not up to your rationality to figure out. Lesson 3: there is something beyond oneself. In this lesson, he talks about owing a commitment to society. When you hear there's something beyond oneself, you think the person is going to start like talking about God or something. He didn't. He talked about owing a commitment to society. He studied philosophy and ethics in college, but I didn't hear him discuss spirituality at all. Um, I do fully believe that he feels strongly in this commitment to society, and that's a lot where horrible atrocities stem from, which is evident again from his life. He was so dedicated to being part of the system, part of the government. At one point, he shakes off responsibilities by just saying his job was just to advise the president. That he was just in full service to the president. The president made the decisions. Like he's just a simple man who had just one job, and that was to advise the president on military affairs. Um, but so in that service, which I do think he took that responsibility very seriously and tried to be the best advisor to the president he could, he subjugated his own judgment in order to do so. Though not directly saying it in the movie, he makes pretty clear he was not a fan of the Vietnam War. Yeah, in good service to his nation, he was one of the major orchestrators of the war. So, where is his sense of self? It seems non-existent. So in believing there's something beyond oneself, don't believe that you don't have a self. Also, don't completely write yourself off, I guess would be one takeaway. But there's a going back to lesson 1 and empathizing with our enemy here. There is a sense in which him and I are in agreement. I think there is certainly something beyond oneself, and that's our descendants. So in the same way that he would commit himself to the nation or the country, which is a fiction, which is maybe a collection of people he doesn't know, interacting in ways he can't comprehend for purposes he's not quite sure, and the people have values he doesn't really know. Um, I would direct that commitment towards the others, to my own family, people that I know and trust and understand, and people who I can actually look out for the interest of are my children, my grandchildren, my parents. My grandparents are all dead now, but you get the point. And they can then do that for their children and grandchildren, instead of dedicating your life to some random person in Oklahoma who you've never met, or some random person in Hawaii you've never met. Uh, what are you really serving if you're trying to serve them? So there is something beyond oneself, and it's our descendants. As to the question of if there's something beyond oneself, as far as God or spirituality, I'm not qualified to answer that. So, in your seventh generation warfare, you will have to decide what kind of role you want spirituality or God to play. Lesson 4: maximize efficiency. At the beginning of the video, I called him a war criminal. Um, it seems harsh to call somebody a war criminal, but he admitted he was. He doesn't really admit anything in the film. He's very good at not quite committing to answers or committing to things, but this is what he said. Um, he says LeMay, that was the general in World War II, said that if we lost the war, we would all have been prosecuted as war criminals, and I think he's right. He and I'd say I were behaving like war criminals. So I mean, it's pretty clear. He thought of himself during World War II as a war criminal. Um, and this was like he was born 1918, so say it was 1944. That's like 26 years old. He was a war criminal. It's a pretty good resume builder there. Certainly helped secure his role as Secretary of Defense, I'd say. Have war criminal experience. But the sad thing here is he didn't getting out of World War II at 26, 27. He didn't reflect on his life and say, I need to change what I'm doing. I repent. I need to go live a more humble life. No, he eventually doubled down, and instead of the atrocities we're about to discuss in World War II, he went and then in Japan, he then went and committed more atrocities in Vietnam. So back to maximizing efficiency, or lesson 4. McNamara was a math whiz. Finding efficiency in numbers and data was his thing, but he apparently forgot to compute the human element, which I don't think there is a computation that you can do for the human element, or how to quantify human suffering. So there was a decision made by Curtis LeMay, the general, to take the B-29 bomber, which was designed to bomb from high altitude, and take it down low, and instead of so that they could hit the targets at a higher efficiency rate, because from high altitude they were just missing bombs were going everywhere, and to switch to incendiary bombs because the Japanese cities were all made of wood, and so these are the recommendations that doing the data crunching, Robert McNamara recommended to Curtis LeMay, and Curtis LeMay, taking this information, changed the bombing tactic to firebombing. And so here's a quote from the movie. In that single night, we burned to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in Tokyo, men, women, and children. That certainly is efficiency. A squadron or two of bombers and you get 100,000 dead Japanese civilians. Certainly is efficient there, Robert. It's also insanely horrifying. But so, what's the takeaway for maximizing efficiency? Yeah, maximizing efficiency is good if it's in a amoral, if it doesn't have a moral context or component to it. Finding the most efficient way to pack a moving truck. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, you can fit more stuff in the moving truck, you can make less trips. Finding more efficient ways to burn to death hundreds of thousands of people, not so good. So try to be efficient, but if humans are part of the calculation, you need to find a way to not, how do I word this? There's no way to compute human suffering, human joy, or human sentiment of any sort into a calculation. So don't try, but also don't think that it's not important. It's insanely important. And yeah. Lesson 5: proportionality should be a guideline in war, and this seems contradictory to his last point, because it is. He was just talking about being being efficient, and then he was talking about being proportional. And in this lesson, I think you really start to see the madness that is Robert McNamara's mind. Um, he so we'll go over a few of the things he says in the movie, and we'll start to see where his nature coming through. So, talking the firebombing raid on Tokyo, McNamara says, "quote I think the issue is not so much incendiary bombs. I think the issue is, in order to win a war, should you kill 100,000 people in one night by firebombing or any other way? LeMay's answer would certainly be yes." Okay, what's your answer, Robert? And then he goes on to say, proportionality should be a guideline in war. Killing 50 to 90% of people in 67 Japanese cities and then bombing them with 2 nuclear bombs is not proportional in the minds of some people to the objectives we're trying to achieve. Okay, Robert, is it proportional in your mind? I don't care about in the minds of some other people. I care is it proportional in your mind? Lastly, he says, I don't fault Truman for dropping nuclear bombs. The US-Japanese War was one of the most brutal wars in all of human history. Kamikaze pilots, suicide, unbelievable. What one can criticize is that the human race prior to that time and today has not really grappled with what are, I'll call it, the rules of war. Well, Robert, you seem to have experienced a lot of high decision making levels in war. What do you think the rules of war should be? What is proportional? He doesn't answer. It's his inability to it's his inability to remove himself from the system. He wants to have a foot in both arenas, or he wants to make it sound like he's reasonable and thinks negatively upon war, but yet engage in it. So again, his rationality will not save us. So how would proportionality in war be useful for 7th generation warfare? I think one of the good takeaways I can come up with for proportionality in 7th generation warfare is, what proportion of your life do you devote to your own interests, and how much of your life do you devote to that of your descendants? There has to be some sort of proportionality there that I don't know. Certainly not seeking to leave the world a better place for your children than it was for you. I certainly think that'll lead to a hellish life that you will not feel fulfilled, and you'll probably also like be filled with a sense of selfishness that you're taking more from the world than you're giving. But on the other hand, you should not just be a robot that is completely devoting your life 100% to that of your children, because then you're not actually showing them what it means to live, and you want your kids to live and pursue their will, so you have to also pursue your own will. So that would be the proportionality question that I would raise in terms of 7th generation warfare, as taking the lesson away from this movie. Lesson 6, get the data. In this lesson, he's mostly talking about his time at the Ford Motor Company. He used data and research and stuff to collect data on competition for the automotive industry to find what the trends were in the markets, things like that. And he also collected a lot of data on fatalities, car accident fatalities, and injuries and things like that. And under his leadership, Ford was one of the first companies to implement a bunch of safety features in the vehicles, including seatbelts. Um, so, uh, I guess good on him for that. He said that they marketed it so like, oh, we can make you so much safer in the car. Use a seatbelt, and no one wanted to do it. I just find that funny that the adoption of the safety features was extremely slow. Um, I resonate with that a lot because people often tell me things that would make my life better, and I completely disregard them. So um, the takeaway of lesson six, get the data, is that without broad understanding of the situation, without getting all those data points, you can't make wise decisions. And this is a valid point, but also too much data can cause analysis paralysis. So you want to achieve a balance. You need to know the problem you're trying to solve enough to know what data you need to collect, and not spend your time pursuing things that aren't relevant. So, in the Marine Corps, we were taught the 70% solution. If you're coming up with a military order, an attack plan, anything like that, you certainly want your plan to be as foolproof as possible, but no plan is going to survive first contact with the enemy. So they might be kind of junk to begin with, but you need to do the planning and the coordination with your friendly elements in order to have some sort of efficiency as you start off. But if you are trying to make it too foolproof of a plan, you're going to spend too much time, and you're going to give time is initiative. You're going to give the initiative to your enemy if you're sitting there crunching data, crunching numbers, trying to figure out all the shortcomings in the enemy's position and everything. You have to come up with a plan. You have to be moderately confident in it, and you just need to have the confidence to commit to it. So um, get enough data, but you don't have to get all the data. Lesson 7. Belief and seeing are both often wrong. Here, McNamara talks about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. If you don't know, Gulf of Tonkin incident was the U.S. Navy thought they were attacked by some Vietnamese ships, and they weren't. And it was a big fiasco, and it's ultimately what led the United States into escalating their efforts in Vietnam. Some people call it a false flag or something like that, but so maybe it was intentional on some people's part, maybe not, but seeing and believing are both often wrong, he says. And the trend in this continues throughout the Vietnam War, when all the officials were talking about escalating. We need to escalate the war in Vietnam in order to accomplish our objectives. And that just wasn't the case. So for this, I would agree. Most beliefs are wrong, and it's kind of the nature of beliefs. Belief stands in opposition to knowing. You believe something because you don't actually have knowledge of it. So you can come to knowledge by rationally examining your senses, seeing or sight being one of them. But you have all your other senses. Your senses alone won't be able to tell you what is true and accurate about the world. But if you rationally examine what your senses are telling you, then you can come to knowledge. You don't come to knowledge by trusting in somebody else's senses. So all this data he's collected throughout his life, more I'd say he was relying on, had trust in other people to tell him what was so. So he never really came to much knowledge about the things he was making decisions about. He was basing it on belief. That belief was actually trust in other people. So I hope that makes sense. um, so for seventh generation warfare, I think for yourself and also for your children, build in a strong epistemology being the study of how you know what you know. Build in a strong epistemological requirements for determining knowledge from belief from faith. Um, distinguish these things in your mind. Be confident, stick to what you know. Give a little bit of credence to some of your better beliefs, but know that they're probably wrong. And then when it comes to faith, well, people use that word differently, so I don't want to trigger anybody. But lesson 8: be prepared to reassess your reasoning. So this was the second instance in which he met with a leader of the enemy decades after the event, and he went to Vietnam and met with some North Vietnamese officials, and they were talking about the Vietnam War, and his assessment of the Vietnam War back in the 60s was completely misguided. McNamara thought that Russia and Chinese communism was infiltrating Vietnam, and the Vietnamese official said, "Have you read any history, McNamara? Don't you know that we've been at war with China? We hate China. We've been at war with them for 1,000 years. What the Vietnam War was a civil war, and we, the Vietnamese people, were determined to gain our independence, and no amount of bloodshed would stop us from achieving that." And so McNamara had failed to in this instance to empathize with the enemy, and he completely misinterpreted what was happening in Vietnam, and a lot of people died because of it. In the film, he asks, we're going back to reassessing your reasoning. In the film, he asks, "What makes us omniscient? Have we a record of omniscience?" And no, we don't have a record of omniscience. We're not omniscient creatures. We are really quite ignorant creatures. Most of the world, most of our experience, we don't actually comprehend at all, in my opinion. And I do think he'll talk about human nature later. I do think it's part of human nature to get very confident in thinking we know more than we know. But that's when we're pretty vulnerable to getting smacked down. Uh, so if we reflect on what I mentioned in the last lesson about trying to understand what we know, we'll come to find out we don't know very much. And this is something I hope to pass on to my children, is again that knowing what you know, understanding the weaknesses and beliefs, being able to avoid mental traps and stuff that in philosophies, in such as the nationalism of McNamara. I suffered from the a lot of these mental traps my whole life. I probably still have some, but being able to identify, one, that these mental traps in philosophy exist, and two, being humble enough to admit that you are part of them at some point, will give you better weaponry to attack the ones that still have you under control. You'll be better able to fight those off if you acknowledge that these mental traps are real and that you can be subject to them. So, lesson 9. In order to do good, you may have to engage in evil. Here he talks about a Quaker named Norman Morrison who, in protest of the Vietnam War, lit himself on fire in front of McNamara's office at the Pentagon. He was holding his baby child at the time. Threw the baby child after he was engulfed in flames. The baby survived. He didn't. Um, and this gets him reflecting about the brutality of and sensibility of killing and the brutality of war. Uh, I don't know. It's not really clear to me how he thinks lesson 9 is a good lesson, but we've already questioned his rationality. He never acknowledges that he could have done otherwise. So this lesson reeks of self-justification to clear his conscience. Um, he acknowledges, I think, that he's participated in evil. He called himself a war criminal, and the things he did only got, potentially more brutal from there. Um, but never does he acknowledge that he had a choice and he chose to do those things. So I think it's really just it's a defensive mechanism so that he doesn't completely crumble as a person, which is quite sad. The truth of the matter is, in order to do good, you have to do good. Um, you can't do evil by doing good. It's like saying in order to have the light on, you must have the light turned off. It makes absolutely no sense, and there are a number of logical contradictions that he had, having studied philosophy, should be able to identify. There's a number of issues wrong with that statement, but do not take up the idea that you can engage in evil and call it good. That's atrocious. So that's probably the only lesson I fully disagree with in this movie. Lesson 10. Never say never. This lesson is more about political life in DC. He accompanies this lesson with another lesson that doesn't get its own number. But that other lesson is never answer the question that is asked of you, answer the question you think was asked of you. And politicians do that a lot. Also, people in everyday life do that a lot. So um, I think it's now that I can identify that people do that, I find it kind of funny. And it makes politics seem, you know, makes politics much more bearable when you're trying to figure out what they heard from the question because they're not answering the question that was asked of them. But as far as seventh generation warfare, I don't know that never say never has much applicable use. I couldn't find any. If you could think of a applicable use for never say never for seventh generation warfare, I'd like to see it in the comments. But yeah, it's mostly just about navigating people's expectations, praises, and criticisms. I think he was, I don't know where he was really going with it. Lesson 11, the final lesson. You can't change human nature. And I think he's right on this. The problem is you can't really define human nature either. There are some broad tendencies that we can point to generally and say that's human nature. And a lot of the times it's like, yeah, there's no way you're going to change that. But so let's look at a quote from him. I'm not so naive or simplistic to believe that we can eliminate war. We're not going to change human nature anytime soon. It isn't that we aren't rational. We are rational. But reason has limits. So he's really directing this at war. It's again another justification that like the war was going to take place anyways, so it didn't matter that I was involved in it. He didn't outwardly say that, but I've heard that as justification from friends. Um, and you don't know that. You can't control what society as a whole does, because society doesn't really exist. It's a concept of a collection of human decisions. And you can say that, well, if I don't participate in the war, it will open up more incentive for somebody else to fill that void and fill my place that was made. Maybe that's true, but you get the satisfaction of knowing you didn't participate in it. You know that if it is possible that all it takes is every individual saying no or saying never, um, if all it takes is saying every individual saying I will never participate in this war, that the war wouldn't actually happen, then you are actually helping to bring about that existence. But if you take up the perspective of, well, war is always going to take place, so therefore it doesn't matter if I have a participation in it or not, you are helping to bring it into existence. So, as far as human nature in other ways, yeah, tendencies of male and female, social sexual hierarchies, things like this, it could very well be human nature, and it's possible that we cannot change it. But first, you have to really, really define what it is that the human nature is that you can't change. Um, I think there is a human element to our experience, a general theme that goes through kind of all of us. Um, that is the same throughout time. It's not changing, but I don't know it well enough to say that it can't be changed. So I hope that concludes the 11 lessons. I hope I've shared enough perspective about Robert S. McNamara as a person and his lessons in life and lessons about war, that you can see why his belief system is so toxic, but also two, how you might be able to prevent yourself from falling victim to it, or even your children from falling victim to it. It is the belief that you owe something to an abstract concept of people called society, that war is inevitable and that it doesn't matter if you participate in it because it's going to happen anyways. And two, that it's not really your position to make a strong judgment on what is or isn't acceptable in war. So, I will say definitively, your involvement or your children's involvement in war is your choice or their choice. It's the choice of the individual. Once you are involved in a war, your involvement is going to be dictated by others. People are going to be giving you orders, telling you what to do, etc. And these people, like Secretary of Defenses, like Robert S. McNamara, not only are they have questionable rationality, but as he acknowledges in the movie, any military leader who's honest with themselves has made mistakes in the application of military force that's gotten people killed unnecessarily. Hold on. And so, yeah, don't become part of the meat grinder is the final takeaway, because you'll be subject to people like Robert S. McNamara. In conclusion, I want to share one more thing about his life that shows that he was so far away from seventh generation warfare. and another reason why his life is a tragic tale. Even though in the movie you'll find him quite likable, I'm sure. Uh, when speaking of his wife in the movie and his time in D.C., he says that his wife and his child got ulcers from the stress of his position and his involvement in Vietnam, and he says that his wife may have ultimately died from that stress. Knowing how little ownership he takes for his actions and how he tries to justify things, that's as much of a confession as you're going to get out of him that he killed his wife with the stress of his profession. So don't admire this guy. Watch the movie, see it for the tragic tale it is, and remember why seventh generation warfare is so important, so that you nor your descendants will end up in a position like this guy. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.